Yeah, I was actually going to pick up where you left off, Osram. I fully agree what you talked about with input and outputs. And I also fully agree on the IFM. And I'm going to talk a little more about what I call the global journey of a real IFM contract. And of course, the reason why I call it real IFM is maybe a little bit provocative, but it's meant as a lot of people are talking IFM or IFS or whatever you want to call it, but I think there are some characteristics that needs to be achieved before you can call it an IFM contract. I'm going to talk a little more about that. But before I started that, just some short minutes about me. The experience behind the journey, I've worked with this for more than 10 years now internationally with IFM. I have been on both sides of the negotiation table. I started out as a service provider for a global IFM provider that doesn't exist anymore since 1st of September, so I guess you know who it is. Always been used to working in IFM context. It was at the IBM, at the Microsoft, those kind of accounts. Then I changed to the other side of the negotiation table. I changed to the biggest bank in the Nordics, where I helped them to develop their first generation of IFM contracts. Moved on to Sony Mobile, where I've been for quite many years, where I actually took the first generation IFM contract to the second generation and also started the journey to the third generation. Before I left, and as you just said, David, 1st of August, I actually changed to NKT, which is an international company that operates in more than 55 countries. I started up to build up their group RE and FM function, and I'm going to run it afterwards. NKT is not a known company, I have learned. But at least from an FM point of view, I think a lot of people working with cleaning have heard about Nilfisk, which is actually part of this group. So that's a little about my experience behind the journey. If I then dive into IFM, what is IFM? And like Osram, I'm also a practical guy, so I actually like to have an FM example. And this example, as you can see here, it's 42 different services that was all included in the FM solution that we had at Sony Mobile. It compromises both the traditional soft services like cleaning, waste handling, catering, receptions, landscaping, you name it, but also the hard services like interior maintenance, building maintenance, technical maintenance, UPSs, emergency diesel generators, whatever, but also site and building security and also transactional services like space management. So that's an FM example from me. If you talked NKT, where I work now, it's 30 services. And that's actually part of when we have to go to the integrated part. I normally talk about 4 different levels of integrations before you have an integrated contract. We have the integrated services, and the example you see here is just to say that it was 42 services delivered by one single supplier. We also talk integrated coverages, meaning that we're not just talking one site, not just talking one country, we are talking either a region, as Osram also showed us with the Citibank, or we are talking a global contract, which I experienced both at Sony and also going to experience at NKT. So we're talking integrated coverages, integrated choreographies. But, as Osram also mentioned, there's also a partnership aspect in this, because when you start to integrate services, you also have to start looking at integrating workplaces. And when I talk about integrated workplaces, I mean physically sitting together with the supplier. So you don't know where the FM organization starts and where the supplier stops. You're physically sitting together both with their operational people, but also with the procurement teams and the HR teams, because you are truly integrated. And that also leads to integrating of organizations. I'm going to get back to that in some of my later slides. So those are the 4 levels that I talk about when I talk integrated FM. And I'm going to dive a little more into these four different areas. If we start out with the integration of services and integration of coverages, this is the traditional steps that we have been going through and all the different models I've been seeing. We always start out with some sort of a degree of in-house service delivery where we have a single service focus or we have a site focus. If we look at the case in Nordea, we actually started out with a contract portfolio with more than 20,000 different contracts and 20,000 different suppliers. And we actually started up a journey to start to bundle those services. And those 20,000 suppliers provided services to 1,100 sites throughout the Nordics. What we did was that we made a strategy that we called the Road to One. And I guess you can get what one means, one IFM supplier. We started bundling the services. We started bundling them in service areas. So we said, okay, instead of having 10 different soft service suppliers. We just have one soft service supplier that deliver all the soft services like cleaning, catering, waste, and restaurant services. We had one supplier looking at all the hard services, one supplier at all the site and building security, and one supplier looking at all the different transactional or space management services. At the same time, we started to, instead of just focusing on sites, we started to focus on countries and regions, saying that, okay, you win an entire country with 300 branches, and that's what you're going to deliver now. That was the first step. The journey I'm describing here is over a 2-year period. The last year, we started out with the journey and say, okay, now we go from those 4 big bundle suppliers to just have one main supplier delivering all these different services under one. And at the same time, we did do a Nordic contract, and we actually ended up with just having one supplier. So over a 3.5 year period, we went from more than 20,000 contracts to just one big. So it is actually doable. To talk a little more about, as Osman also highlighted, when you do this, you have to start to change the service delivery model as well, and you have to start to focus on user needs and also what the company needs. And you have to start to go from the inputs we talked about before, the inputs where you talk about frequencies, how often they should clean this, how often they should change filters, to start looking at outputs instead. And to give also another example about what could be outputs, we actually, when we went for having a lot of different technical suppliers to go to just one, the technical supplier came back to us and said, why do you change filters twice a year? And the reason why we changed filters twice a year is that was what we always did. We've done that for 28 years. And that's also what we thought was necessary. But the supplier came back and said, have you thought about just upgrading your technology, upgrading your filter technology, and it will cost you only 5% more, but on the other hand, you only have to change the filters once a year instead of twice a year. So all of a sudden, we had a 40% savings on that one alone. We still had the functional need, as Osman also described. We still had the same output, we still had the same availability, and we still had the same high level of user satisfaction. One of the things that we also worked a lot when it came to the output-based focus is to actually focus on user satisfaction and user needs. Because if you ask me, after all, perception is reality. So you can have a huge Excel spreadsheet that says that this is clean because they have now cleaned it 100 times. But if you ask the end users, they say, no, this looks like crap, then it looks like crap. I normally call this watermelon green, that it's green in the Excel spreadsheet, but when you look inside, it's completely red like a watermelon. So we started to measure user satisfaction, say that, okay, to the supplier, we don't care about how you clean or when you clean. We want the users to perceive this as clean. That is how we're going to measure you. That was quite a change. Some say you lose control, but on the other hand, what we did experience instead is that we saved a lot of money and we actually got a better user satisfaction because the supplier was actually better at planning and executing than we were when we tried to do the inputs. And what I've also seen over the last couple of years is that we actually try to go to the next step, not just focus on outputs. We actually also started to focus on outcomes. Outputs is very much linked to FM areas, when outcomes is more linked to the business. So instead of just trying to drive down the total or the cost of the FM area, we try to focus on driving down the total cost of ownership of the company. So why not start to measure the supplier? They can actually help you to optimize square meters, because the less square meters you use, I think we heard about yesterday that, was it Peter who said that in average it's only utilization around 40%, and that's the same experience I have. So if you can actually go from a 40% to a 70% utilization, we're talking a tremendous cost saving. So what we actually did was that we tried to take the services and actually start to say we want to focus on the company outcomes. We don't care about the inputs, how you do it. We are focusing on driving down the total cost of ownership, not just in FM, but for the entire company. One of the last things that we also started to look at was to actually try to look at what we call increased company productivity. So what we actually said was that, why do we only focus on driving down the cost? Why don't we focus on actually doing co-creation? We had, at that time, a global supplier that was really, really good. They had a huge knowledge base about the services. They were represented in more than 55 countries around the world. And on the other hand, in Sony, we were really good at making mobile phones. We had some really good software engineers that were really good at making apps. So why didn't we try to get together their technology guys that knew about the services and our technology guys who knew about app development and try to get them into the same room? So what we actually started to put into the contract was actually do co-creation. Because when you do have a mobile phone, you actually know, at least when we worked at Sony, we knew exactly where everyone were in our buildings. So we know that David was sitting right there. We know I was standing 1 meter away from David. So all of a sudden, we started to have real-time utilization data. We know which toilets they went to, we know which meeting rooms they went to, and all of a sudden, we could actually come with something that the service supplier could also see a benefit of actually developing together. So what we actually did was to start to develop apps and services that both we as a company could sell, but also the service provider could actually benefit at other customers. So we actually moved from inputs to outputs to also start to focus on outcomes. Yeah. If we then move on to looking at the partnership or looking at the internal demand organization, you also have to start up a maturity journey. Because when you start to go through this in-house service and you start to outsource and you start to bundle and you start to go for an integrated model, you also need to start actually looking at how mature is the company. Osman talked about maturity of different countries. That's one thing. I also talk about the maturity of both the demand organization and the service provider. And what you do have to understand is that when you go from an input-based, you are more operational, you are more focused on day-to-day operation and supervision. When you start to go towards outputs, you become more demand-focused, tactical planning, it's more about coordination. And when you start to move to more outcomes, you start to become really a strategic partner that actually focus on forecasting and follow-up. And that actually is a huge change in how people act, how they behave, and how they actually also engage with suppliers. And you need to be able to identify that and help people to grow on that journey. And on the other hand, if you start to do that, you also have to make sure that the supplier are actually ready to do that. Because when they're just delivering single services, quite easily, they just show up, you tell them what to do, they don't have to think so much, and they only have to focus on how they can optimize that single service. But when you start to do this bundling of services, they have to start to look at an entire area, because all of a sudden they have the risk, as Osman also mentioned. They need to optimize. And when you go to the last team, your last stage, you actually start to see that you have dedicated account teams, you have dedicated subject matter expertise, that you have the right people at the right levels. So that's just to say that there are maturity journey you have to go to, and it's not easy for everyone. Because being a manager of 150 people is one thing, but all of a sudden, when you're at the end of this journey, you might just be a manager of 2 people, and the rest is actually outsourced. That is a complete different way you have to manage and think how you actually work with services. And not everyone can do that, honestly speaking. So that's a journey as well. The last slide is actually very much focused, as Osman also said, about the partnership. It is building this strong relationship. Because what you have to focus on is to make sure that the organizations are actually aligned. And normally in FM, we talk about this single point of contact, where you have these 2 pyramids, and then the pointy ends point at each other. And I normally call that the single point of failure, because that's normally a bottleneck. That's normally not the best way to do it. The best way I've experienced to do it is actually to have 2 pyramids, where you have the broad sides focusing on each other. And that what you try to build up is to have a global level that meets global level, regional level, local level, subject matter expertise level that have a single point of contact on all of these different levels. And then what you then try to do is actually to build up the frames that they should act within. Make sure that they have the mandate, so when they meet on a site level, that my facility manager meet up with a site manager from the supplier, they both have the right mandate to actually make decisions. They don't have to escalate and ask all the time for more money. It's their budget. They need to decide what they want to do, but it's also their risk to actually do it. So that's the mandate we have to push down. At the same time, we have to define the frames to make sure that they know when they have to escalate, when it becomes too expensive, or when they cannot agree, when should they escalate and how should they escalate. That's the matching organization theory. Then at the same time, it's easy just to draw up an organizational chart. You have to fill it with people. And when you do this journey, you need to really look at, say, do you have the right people? So what we developed is actually an example for Nordea. We made a maturity assessment. We actually tried to define and said, okay, do we have the right people? Do they have the right value proposition, the right behavior, the right orientation? Do they know what they're talking about? And at the same time, we also had to look at the processes. Do we have the right governance, the right structure, so the right people will meet? And also systems, as we heard about earlier, the BIM system, for instance, which I'm quite used to working with as well. Many times you have it, but you use it in different ways in different countries. So you might have the right system, but you have the wrong usage. And what we did find out when we did this maturity assessment is that we were not that good. We were really bad at some areas, and we needed to grow if we wanted to go down this journey. And what I've tried to integrate with all these different graphs up here and all the different colors is that it's not just a maturity assessment based on the FM organization. We did exactly the same for the supplier organization, the service provider, the procurement organization, also some other internal stakeholders. And what we did find out was that different organizations have different views on how good they were and how they viewed other organizations. And that was actually a key learning for us, because all of a sudden we thought we were world champions and we were the best, but when we talked to the procurement guys, they said, you're not that good, and the service provider thought we were even worse. So how do we actually grow that maturity together, how to become more mature together? There are also, if you want to look into this, if you don't want to develop your own tools, there are some good tools on the internet. I know Peter also mentioned yesterday one of the new trends called Vested FM, which is a model, or in my mind, it's a mindset. There are some tools out there where you can actually go online, do a self-assessment of the 12 normal ailments, the 12 normal failures in a contract. You do it both as a supplier and as a demand organization, and then you evaluate each other, and that is a huge learning experience for most people because you get some really valid input, and normally you don't agree on most of these items, so it also opens up for a good discussion to grow together. If we talk about the maturity assessment, so now we have the organization, now we have the mature people, we have the right people. It takes a couple of years to do that. Then we also have to make sure that we actually have the right governance set up. And one of the ways that I've looked at that has worked really well at both Nordea and Sony, and also hopefully going to work very well at NKT, is that I call it governance both ways. It should not just be us measuring the supplier, what we think, it should also be the supplier measuring us the other way. And one of the things that I've always introduced into contracts is what I call the buyer satisfaction, which could be a little misleading. But basically what it does is that we have 5 simple questions we always ask. How is general performance? How is general documentation? How is invoicing? How is proactiveness? And how is projects? And we don't define the questions further than that. That's as simple as we define them. And what we then do is that we have a 5 scale. 1 is very dissatisfied, 5 is very satisfied. We do the assessment of the current relationship on all the different levels we talked about up here, global, regional, and local. And at the same time, we get the supplier to do exactly the same measurement from their side. We meet up once a month for 1 hour, talk the traditional KPIs, we talk the traditional cost, but at the same time, we also talk about this. And what we normally end up is that I gave the supplier a 2 because I think the proactiveness was bad. They gave themselves a 5, and all of a sudden, we have misaligned expectations. So what that forces us to do is actually align expectations and to understand, why did I give you a 2? Why did you give yourself a 5? And what I have experienced normally is that from the supplier organization, you're forced to understand the expectations of the demand organization, but also the demand organizations is also forced to understand what the supplier thinks, because often you didn't understand that the reason why he wasn't so proactive or the report was bad was actually that he had 5 other reports he had to do to you, and those 5 reports were actually quite good. So why are you just complaining about 1? So he has the opportunity to actually do some sale back to you. So you are forced to understand what he's doing. So that's the governance and continuously aligning expectation. That was actually my last slide. So just to recap, 4 levels of integration: integrating services, integrated coverages, integrated workplaces, and integrated organizations. Then you're talking a real IFM contract, in my view. Yeah.